Hello, and in this session we're going to talk about the key changes between the Public Contracts Regulations 2015 and the Procurement Act 2023. I'm Tim Kerr and I'm a partner in the Public Sector team at Ward Hadaway.
And I'm Patrick Saunders, an associate at the Public Sector team in Ward Hadaway.
So Patrick, you know how I'm going to start this, don't you?
I have a feeling.
Can you tell me what the key changes are?
Thanks, Tim. Easy question to start. I think the best way to start would probably be by asking, why did the government decide to introduce the Procurement Act?
Oh, right, okay, right, I get that. So why did the government decide to introduce the new Procurement Act?
Thanks, Tim. Great question.
Excellent.
So following Brexit, the Conservative government wanted to reform public procurement to achieve three policy objectives, which it set out for the House of Lords in 2022. To speed up and simplify the processes, to place value for money at the heart of the processes, and to create greater opportunities for small businesses and social enterprises in order to innovate public service delivery. In order to achieve these aims, the Act seeks to consolidate four sets of regulations: Public Contract Regulations 2015, the Utilities Contract Regulations 2016, Concession Contracts Regulations 2016, and the Defence and Security Public Contract Regulations 2011. That was a bit of a mouthful.
Just a bit.
It tries to consolidate all of those into a one-stop procurement shop, in which you can find all of the law relating to England and Wales, and within which a lot of the EU terminology has been removed. It is only a one-stop shop if you completely ignore the fact that the Procurement Regulations 2024 exist and provide a huge amount of vital guidance. Let's humour them and call it a one-stop shop for now.
Okay, I get there's a bit of flexibility as to what consolidation means. So if it is just about consolidation, then presumably all the existing principles we're used to in procurement law still exist.
Great question. No. The Act removes reference to the old Regulation 18 principles and instead replaces them with something completely new and different called objectives. These objectives, which are applicable to all covered procurements. Now, covered procurement is a public contract which is above the relevant threshold for goods, services or works. These objectives are contained within Section 12 and are split into mandatory and those which a contracting authority must have regard to.
Okay.
So those for which it must have regard are delivering value for money, maximising public benefit, sharing information for the purpose of allowing suppliers to understand the authority's procurement policies and decision. I'm going to refer to that as transparency from now on, so it's a bit easier. Acting and being seen to act with integrity. It's also probably going to come under the banner of transparency, I would say. It must also have regard for the fact that small and medium-sized enterprises may face particular difficulties or barriers to participation, and so consider whether it can remove those barriers. But then the mandatory things it has to abide by are it must treat suppliers the same unless there's a difference between the suppliers which justifies that different treatment. And if a contracting authority considers that the different treatment is justified in a particular case, the authority must take all reasonable steps to ensure that it doesn't put a supplier at an unfair advantage or disadvantage. If these are feeling a little bit familiar, that's because they aren't actually drastically different to the old principles. But you can see that the government aims, particularly around transparency and improving opportunities for SMEs, are front and centre within the objectives.
Right, I get that. I get the bringing the SMEs, as you say, to the front of the agenda. That's very interesting, isn't it? So, okay, that's great. Looking at the broad question of objectives.
Yeah.
How does it work?
Okay, fair enough. We'll tackle the following topics in turn. So, simplification, flexibility, transparency, and exclusions and debarment.
Okay.
So starting with simplification, as well as providing the one-stop procurement shop, ignoring the regulations, the Act also establishes another one-stop shop in the form of the Central Digital Platform. This is where you're going to find notices, and I'll come on to those later, above threshold procurement opportunities, supplier information, and much, much more. We'll cover this in more detail in future podcasts, but when it's up and running, what it should do is make finding and supplying information much more simple than it is now. There's also another simplification, which is on the basis on which a contracting authority can make an award. It goes from most economically advantageous tender, or MEAT, to most advantageous tender, or MAT. In theory, this should take the money side of things out of it, and you might be able to perhaps put more weight on quality. We'll see how this works. It might have a significant impact, it might not. But again, we'll cover this in more detail in future podcasts. The big change really is this consolidation into a single act.
Right, I get that. I get the simplification point that you're talking about. So I think you said, so the next topic was flexibility.
Absolutely. And another big question. The Act introduces a competitive flexible procedure, open frameworks, and dynamic markets, as well as formalising direct awards. Those four new options, in inverted commas, I suppose, together with normal competitive processes and normal frameworks, give contracting authorities as many options as they can possibly want and as much flexibility to ensure that they can deliver value for money and maximise the public benefit achieved by their procurements.
Right, I see what you did there.
Thank you.
That's very good. But can you tell us what the competitive flexible procedure is?
Absolutely. It's essentially exactly what it sounds like. It's a tender process which can be designed by a contracting authority to be as flexible as they require. So, for example, the process may limit the number of suppliers. It might provide for refinement of award criteria, and it could exclude suppliers in certain circumstances. Broadly, it can follow whichever form desired by a contracting authority, and it's worth noticing that though references to negotiation and or dialogue have been removed from the Act, these tools can also be used within a competitive flexible procedure. To preempt your next question, an open framework, one of the other new processes, is a framework that's set up for a maximum of 8 years, which effectively actually operates as a series of frameworks. And these are re-procured on broadly the same terms or opened up during the term. The initial period before which the first opening up must take place is within the first 3 years. And then for the remaining 5 years, it must be opened again. So effectively what you'll have is a series of 3 substantially similar frameworks, minimum, within those 8 years. But there's nothing to stop you from, for example, opening it up once within the first year, and then the first 3 years, and then a further 5 times every year or something like that.
Okay, so just going back to your initial comments about simplification, I'm wondering whether necessarily people will think that is that simple.
It's not necessarily simple, but until you get your head around it as it's an open framework, but it's a framework which can be, it's effectively that series of frameworks, and you could get more suppliers in. That might not tick the flexibility box, the simplicity box, but it certainly ticks the flexibility box.
No, I get that. I can see what you're saying. Okay, you also mentioned a moment ago something called dynamic markets.
Yeah.
So is that basically just an old dynamic processing system with a new name?
Another good question, and another no. So there are a few differences, but a key difference between a dynamic market and a DPS is that dynamic markets can only be used for covered procurements. This means that DPSs in the past were used by authorities to procure lots of low-value goods.
Yes.
So, for example, building materials or taxi contracts. That's no longer possible. Dynamic markets also allow for suppliers to join at any time. As long as they meet the criteria for membership, there's no time limit for doing so, and contracting authorities are not permitted to limit the number of suppliers able to join a dynamic market. Another change is that you no longer make call-offs from dynamic markets, as was the case with the DPS. You now award contracts with reference to the dynamic market, and these contracts are entirely independent. So they're not on the same terms as the DPS. They're effectively, a dynamic market effectively operates as a list of suppliers to whom you can award a contract rather than more like a traditional framework.
Right, so I think I get the subtle difference there. It's a marketplace. You've just defined the marketplace.
Absolutely right.
That's the marketplace you go to award your contract under the dynamic market, which
Absolutely.
is different to a DPS. I can see that.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely right.
Yes. Okay.
And a final thing is also provision for a supplier to be removed from the dynamic market if they become excluded or excludable suppliers. We'll touch on what this means below, and we'll explain it in much more detail in another podcast.
Right. Understood. Yes, we don't want to get into too much complexity in this one. Which I think then, when you were talking about the different sort of routes to market, I think that leaves us with direct awards.
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
So the big change in the Act is that there's now a chapter dedicated to and called Direct Award,
Right.
rather than the old Regulation 32.
Yeah.
Broadly, the justifications for making a direct award are the same as they were under the regs. For example, you can make a direct award for the production of a prototype, testing, research and development, unique piece of art, where competition's absent due to technical reasons or intellectual property, that sort of thing.
Yes. Yes.
That's all the same as was before. But there are a couple of more dramatic changes. So one is that the justification of urgency remains. However, and I'm sure you've never heard of this happening in practice, and I can't imagine a time when it would, but if the urgency is completely down to the act, or not even completely down, it's down to the act of an authority, and it was foreseeable, you can't rely on that urgency. So if something's just been sat on for too long and it has suddenly become urgent, it's not urgent for the purposes of the Act.
Understood.
There's also a change to the justification for repeat goods, services and works when previously procured under a tender.
Right.
So previously you could do so if the award was in 3 years. Now it's within 5. But crucially, if you intend to do this, or you even foresee a situation where you could do this in the future, you have to make it absolutely clear that this could happen within your tender notice and documentation. That previously wasn't there.
All right. So when you're doing your initial procurement,
Yes.
you need to think ahead, potentially a period of 5 years, and think, am I going to want to renew or repeat this contract later down the road and use direct award?
Absolutely right.
Right.
Yeah.
That requires some foresight.
It does. It absolutely does. One last thing on direct award. There's also a new justification, which is to protect life. This clearly stems from COVID, but it can only be used where the Secretary of State has published a specific regulation to allow it.
Right. So I imagine that if we had, another COVID.
COVID 25.
Yes.
Yeah.
Secretary of State for Health perhaps would pass a regulation that says, because of this, in order to protect life, I can do direct awards of contracts for PPE,
Yeah.
etc. So is that the sort of thing you think
That's
it
the
would
sort of
deal
thing.
with?
Yeah, absolutely right.
Understood. Okay, I can see why that could be useful to governments going forward.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Okay, understood. So, right, I think that dealt with the flexibility point.
Yeah,
And then you were going to talk about transparency, is that right?
I was indeed.
Yes.
So if I could sum transparency up in a word, it's a gross simplification, but I'd use the word notices.
Right.
I'll only touch on what those notices are because, frankly, I could write a whole podcast and then do a whole podcast on it. Funnily enough, I will. But there's now up to 8 notices which a contracting authority must publish for below threshold procurement, up to 12 for a covered procurement, and an additional pipeline notice for contracting authorities who expect to award over £100 million worth of contracts in the next financial year.
Right, that's a lot of notices. And particularly you mentioned there below threshold, which is an area where you think it's a sort of light touch from a regulatory point of view, but up to 8 notices.
Absolutely right. Up to 8. And transparency is front and centre, and this will achieve that aim.
Okay, well, that's a lot. Yeah.
It is, and I think there are a lot of contracting authorities who are concerned about it. However, the benefit to suppliers of being able to easily understand opportunities being available, when contracts are coming to an end, and how they're being performed by incumbent suppliers, I think does outweigh that work.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So you just mentioned there about, I think you said monitoring how contracts are being performed or something like that. What does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So contracting authorities will now be required to publish an annual contract performance notice. Does exactly what it says on the tin. It sets out a supplier's performance against KPIs which are set out in the contract, and they're also contracting authorities are also required to publish an additional contract performance notice within 30 days of a breach by a supplier if that breach has led to termination of a contract.
Right. And are there any other consequences that a supplier has to worry about if, in terms of contract performance and poor performance?
Yeah, which leads us neatly onto the fourth point that I raised earlier, which is exclusions of debarment. So thank you for that, Tim.
Right.
Feel like a bit of a broken record here, but again, I'm not going to go into huge detail on this, as we are going to cover this extensively in a future podcast. However, essentially, exclusions of debarment are the process by which contracting authority can exclude suppliers from bidding for or winning public contracts. The grounds for doing so are separated into discretionary and mandatory grounds and deal with things like past performance, criminal convictions, insolvency, things like that. Like I say, we'll go into much more detail in another podcast. Now, exclusions of debarment aren't designed to punish suppliers or deter suppliers from certain behaviours. It's designed to give contracting authorities the ammunition it needs and as much information as possible when embarking on a process. Another thing to note is that unless the ground leading to a possible exclusion is mandatory, the authority can decide to ignore it when embarking on a procurement process. That might seem obvious, but I wouldn't want to discourage or worry suppliers too much that if they have a single discretionary exclusion ground against them, it's going to preclude their participation in future processes.
Yeah, understood. And I think you're right. I think we're going to talk about exclusion in a separate session, aren't
Yes,
we?
we are.
Okay, so there's a lot to digest here, and obviously we can unpack that in different sessions. Is there anything else that's changed?
Yeah, I think the final thing that I'd raise is we are witnessing the death of the selection questionnaire. I'm sure there are many who will mourn its passing. However, it has been criticised, particularly by SMEs, for being a very onerous document to complete, particularly given that it requires completion for every single open opportunity.
So you're saying suppliers don't need to provide that information anymore?
Weirdly enough, no. Suppliers do still need to provide their information, but a lot of the certainly more basic information that was required in the SQ will now be held on the central digital platform, and in theory, it'll only need to be provided once and then periodically updated just to make sure that it's up to date. This information to be included will include basic information like name and address, financial and economic standing information, information relating to connected persons, and also those potential grounds for exclusion and things like that.
Oh, right.
This should streamline processes and make it easier for all suppliers to bid for contracts. And again, a future podcast will go into the central digital platform in much more detail, like I mentioned earlier. As for the rest of the information that was previously included on the SQ, the Cabinet Office have helpfully now produced the procurement specific questionnaire, PSQ. This asks for confirmation that the information required to be submitted on the central digital platform has been submitted. It'll allow submission of details of specific connected parties relevant to the contract being bid for, and it will also allow you to fill out the conditions of participation. Now, realistically, until we start using the PSQ, we won't know exactly how it works and whether it is a replacement for the SQ. It feels like it is, and it does feel like it's going to fill the gap that's left by the death of the SQ, but we'll have to wait and see how it works.
Okay, but for now we need to get used to saying PSQ rather than SQ.
We absolutely do. It's another enormous change brought about by the Procurement Act.
Okay, so I think in summary, there's a number of features of the Procurement Act that are broadly the same and we'll be familiar with, but it seems like there's also a number of areas where there have been some subtle changes, some nuanced changes, some changes of language. So there is actually a fair amount we're going to have to get used to under the new regime.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think there's also a fair amount to cover in future podcasts.
Yes, and we will do that in other sessions. Thank you, Patrick. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.